The story we're going to go over today is that of the infamous, notorious, and despicable serial killer BTK. Brace yourselves for this one because it is dark and pretty heinous. Not in a graphic blood type of way, but just the overall depraved and truly disturbing mindset and crimes that he committed. I mean, this guy is seriously subhuman. But the reason we're going to be talking about it is because it is, yes, one of the most infamous true crime cases out there, but it also still has so many details that the general public isn't aware of. There also is a newly heightened interest in BTK as Bryan Kohberger is being compared to him and even suspected to have taken bits and pieces of BTK's profile and make it his own, all due to Bryan studying directly under the professor who worked so closely with BTK and even wrote his biography. Many think that Bryan, being the criminology buff that he is, stole characteristics of BTK's murders to either pay homage to him or to mimic the profile, which as we go, you be the judge of that and let me know. In any event, this is a case that you definitely want to have an empty stomach for because it will surely make you sick to your stomach. So buckle up because we are going to do a deep dive on exactly who this maniac was and the trail of terror that BTK left in his wake throughout Wichita, Kansas for almost 3 decades. Hey guys, I'm Elise. This is 10 to Life. Let's dive right in. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945 in Kansas. He had 2 loving parents and 3 brothers, and his parents were very well regarded in their community and their church. Even though both parents worked long hours and paid little attention to their children at home, Dennis described his upbringing as very normal. And in one interview, Dennis explained, "I got along real well with Dad, but Mom wasn't always so happy. I've always loved her. I still love her greatly. But I did have a little bit of a grudge against Mama." Even though by all accounts nothing in his life seemed out of the ordinary, Dennis always knew that he had something peculiar and sinister about him. One occasion that Dennis has described as possibly being the starting point for the trajectory of the rest of his life was when he was just a young boy, the day his mom's ring got caught on a couch spring and she couldn't get her hand out. She was terrified and told him, "Go get help, go get help." But instead, Dennis said that he felt the first stirrings of arousal, possibly the first feelings of arousal in general, given his age. He felt excited watching a woman helpless, and it was the beginning of his ideas about women and that what he wanted from them was to keep them trapped and helpless and looking to him in terror. This memory ultimately became imprinted in his mind and became the image he was always after. When Dennis was in 5th grade, he had an issue with his teacher. He felt like she was domineering and mean to him and had embarrassed him in class one day. So Dennis decided to go to her house and watch her through the windows. Most of the time, he would just see her doing mundane things. But Dennis was hooked in doing this. Something about watching a woman that had no idea that she was being watched gave Dennis a sense of power, control, and a sense of control over the situation. And this was very arousing to Dennis. One day as he was being a peeping Tom, Dennis took a rope with him and he tied it around his waist and he watched her. Something about the rope around his waist while watching her brought him back to those feelings of power, control, and arousal. But this time, he actually got off, if you know what I mean. Now, I don't know if he was physically actually touching himself when this occurred or if it was just the thought as he was, watching her and feeling the rope, but in any event, it came to a completion. And I know that's literally nauseating and disgusting, but this is the level of twisted and the sick kind of person that he is. In his later teen years, sometimes Dennis would bind his hands and ankles with rope and cover his head with a bag. He also cut out photos of women from magazines whom he found arousing and drew ropes and gags on them, on their images, imagining how he could restrain and control them. Dennis has described his childhood saying that he sort of had some problems, sexual fantasies, probably more than normal. All males probably go through some kind of a sexual fantasy. Mine was probably a bit weirder than other people. Yeah, bro, you think? That's like not even the definition of weird. You can't even use that word. It's something completely different, which I can't even think of what word comes to mind except ew. Ugh, ew. Dennis also tortured, killed, and sometimes even hung small animals. Now, we've heard all about this as being like a red flag in young children. The second somebody is found torturing animals, it's like, they're going to most likely turn into a complete sociopath. So he was torturing, killing, and even would hang them up sometimes. So this, combined with his sadistic sexual fantasies, would later turn him into one of America's most heinous serial killers, who played a sick game of cat and mouse with law enforcement for almost 3 decades. His shocking arrest blew the minds of everybody he knew, because he hid in plain sight as a loving husband and a good man. And ultimately, that threw a wrench in the characterization and profiles of serial killers, because he didn't fit the stereotypical mold like his infamous predecessors. So what was his life like? Well, somehow he maintained an ordinary appearance and could compartmentalize the dark and deviant side of himself. Dennis graduated high school from Wichita Heights High School and later went to a local university, but ultimately dropped out after a year. From there, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and served for 4 years between 1966 and 1970. After that, he returned back to Kansas, this time in Park City, and he caught up with his old friends and was beginning to start the rest of his life. His mom ended up introducing him to a girl from the local church that she wanted to set Dennis up with, and her name was Paula. Well, Dennis and Paula hit it off, and they got married in 1971. They had a house in Park City, Kansas, and during this time, everything on the surface seemed completely normal for Dennis. He had a job as an electrician for the Coleman Company, which is an outdoor supply company, and he went back to college and received an associate's degree in electronics in 1973. In 1975, Dennis and Paula had welcomed their firstborn child, Bryan. Bryan, but it's Bryan with an I. After Bryan was born, Dennis continued his education and later got a bachelor's degree in science and administrative justice at Wichita State University. During that time, Dennis and Paula had their second child, a daughter named Carrie. Dennis was a good father and loved his wife and children deeply. He was a member of Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita and had been elected president of the church council and was also a Cub Scout leader. From 1974 to 1988, he worked at the Wichita-based office of ADT Security, where he installed security alarms. In May of 1991, he became a compliance officer in Park City. In this position, neighbors recalled him as being sometimes overzealous and extremely strict, as well as taking special pleasure in bullying and harassing single women. But other than that one account, not only was he well liked within his community, he came off as the perfect husband and father and an upstanding citizen. Now let's dig a little deeper into what else Dennis was up to during that time, because as you'll soon find out, this side of his life was a complete and utter farce. I know that was a lot of dates that I just spit out at you and a lot of information, but don't worry because it is all going to come together shortly. Now, after Dennis and Paul got married, Dennis had a job as an electrician while working towards his associate degree. However, at some point in 1973, Dennis was laid off from his job. Dennis was 28 years old and out of work, and this was a huge blow to him. So while he spent time at home planning his next move while his wife was at work, unbeknownst to everybody, Dennis was actually planning a different next move entirely. Losing his job is actually what set him off to commit his first home break-in. Now, obviously, that is a huge leap. People don't just get laid off or get fired or even quit their job and decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to start breaking into homes. But this was a big leap for Dennis. Dennis says that he was just frustrated with the system and had an opportunity, and so he wanted to go on the prowl and decided to break into his first home. Dennis planned this and even had some practice sessions, all to amp himself up and to get himself ready to do this. But even though the people that had lived inside the home had absolutely nothing to do with him losing his job, Dennis said that he basically wanted to do something deviant as a way to relieve his frustration. And this goes back to his distorted sense of power and control from his childhood. To him, planning and organizing a crime was taking his power back. But he didn't stop at just breaking into homes and being a pervert and stealing bras and underwear during these break-ins. Dennis decided that he wanted to up the ante, and this time to do something even darker. This is when his heinous murder spree began. Ted Bundy once said, "We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow." Serial killers was a phrase coined after Ted Bundy, and as much as I hate to say it, he was kind of dead on when it came to Dennis Rader. Julie and Joseph Otero had 5 children and had just moved to Wichita, Kansas. Dennis saw Julie walking her children to school while he was driving his own wife to work, and he just picked her at random and said, "That's her." He stalked her for a little bit to learn her schedule and knew that her husband and children should be gone during the weekdays. But on January 15th, 1974, Julie and Joseph's 3 oldest children had gone to school that day, leaving the other 2 younger ones, 9-year-old Joey Jr. and 11-year-old Josie, at home with their parents. Joseph, Julie's husband, wasn't going to work that day. When Dennis approached the home, he encountered a dog, which also threw him off completely. He had never seen a dog and wasn't aware that the family had one. Then he took a pair of wire cutters and snipped the phone line so that Julie wouldn't be able to call the police. While doing this and peeping in the windows, he saw that Julie's husband was home. At this point, Julie was the only person that Dennis had planned on killing, and he didn't expect Joseph to be there. In fact, he even wondered if this would be a problem for him. In the end, though, he didn't care. He had made his decision, and he would do the same thing when it came upon the 2 youngest children. This was what he planned, and anyone who stood in the way of that would have to go as well. It didn't matter if she was the target, and if there were other people in the home, he had a mission set out in front of him. If you catch my drift there with the parallels to Kohberger. Dennis said that Joey Jr. and Josie were forced to watch while he strangled their parents to death. Then Dennis strangled Joey Jr. and dragged Josie down into the basement where Dennis pulled off her underwear and hung her from a sewer pipe. Her last words were to ask what would happen to her. And Dennis calmly told her, "Well, honey, you're going to be in heaven tonight with the rest of your family." He took pictures of the dead bodies and gathered up Josie's underwear as a trophy of his first murders. Then, this heartless, evil, disgusting excuse for a human went home to his wife and acted like nothing had ever happened. After all, he had to go home and get ready for church. When the older children arrived back home, their son Charlie, who was 15 at the time, walked to the back gate and realized that their dog Lucky was outside in the snow, which was not normal for Lucky. Charlie opened up the back door and noticed that his mom's purse was on the stove, flipped open. Then one of his siblings who went to the school that day ran up to Charlie and said, "Hey, don't come back here. Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." So Charlie went back there, opened his parents' bedroom door, and found his mom laying on the bed, beat up. His father had a belt around his neck, and everything smelled like death. Charlie told his brother to call the police, but the brother said that the phone wasn't working. So the brother went next door and called the police. When the police arrived, they talked to the 3 older children and realized that they didn't know where their 2 younger siblings, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josie, were. When the police went through the house, they found Joey dead in his bedroom, but Josie was in the basement, hanging from a pipe. One of the things that the crime scene investigators noticed was that whoever did this changed the thermostat and set the heat on extremely high to make the bodies decompose faster and to mess up the police's ability to estimate the time of death. Another thing, nothing in the house was stolen. So who did this? And what was their motive? Well, when the police found Josie in the basement, again, who is 11 years old, she was partially clothed, and there was male fluid on her and around her body. This told investigators that the crime was sexually motivated, even though poor Josie wasn't touched in that way and wasn't forced to participate in any acts of that nature. Instead, this was done by a sicko that did this for his own solo gratification. Unfortunately, back in 1974, there wasn't much that could be done with DNA at all. However, the police department took the DNA evidence properly and secured it. One thing was taken from the house that police never noticed: a small radio. The family murders were the first taste of a maniac in Wichita or in Kansas in general, and the police were hopeful that this was a one-off situation. But obviously they were wrong. Dennis continued, and each of his hunting conquests for victims would be something he would later call his projects. Each one had a unique name, like Project Green, for example. From here, he would scope out victims in a particular neighborhood, one that was close to a highway, which Dennis thought would be helpful for an easy getaway. A few months later, on April 4th, 1974, Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old who Dennis had worked with before he was fired, arrived home around 2 p.m. with her brother Kevin. Now remember, Dennis was going to school at Wichita State, but he still found time between classes to watch her and to learn her schedule. He spent about a month watching her and knew that he could easily break into her apartment while she was gone and then kill her. Dennis planned for 2 o'clock, which just goes to show how bold and brazen he was, to think that it would be a good idea to carry out a crime in the middle of the day. Nevertheless, Catherine and Kevin went back to her apartment and were ambushed by Dennis, who was hiding in Catherine's bedroom. Dennis ran out with a gun pointed straight at them. He was shocked to see Kevin, but at that point, once again, he was already committed to going through with this and had no option but to kill both of them. He forced Catherine and Kevin into her bedroom and ordered Kevin to tie Catherine's hands and feet. Then he took Kevin into another room, and while trying to tie him up, Kevin fought back and almost took the gun away from him, but was unfortunately unsuccessful. Then Dennis took the gun and shot Kevin in the head twice, thinking that he was dead. Then he went back to Catherine and tried to strangle her. While that was happening, somehow Kevin wasn't dead miraculously and was able to escape. Strangling Catherine wasn't working, and Dennis started to freak out a little bit when he noticed that the apartment door was wide open, and that's when he started to stab her in the stomach multiple times. Kevin was able to run away and found some bystanders that helped him, thank goodness. But Catherine wasn't so lucky. After emergency surgeries and blood transfusions, she passed away. Kevin was in critical condition, but ended up miraculously surviving. Since Kevin survived, he was actually able to give the police this sketch. Now remember, guys, this was the 70s, so I know that picture is a little bit lacking compared to what sketches are these days. Dennis did not necessarily want to stab Catherine, but he did it because he was panicking. And Dennis never used a knife again because he said it didn't give him the same satisfaction as torturing people. Dennis loved the attention these crimes were getting in the newspaper, and he loved feeling smarter than the police. Smarter than the police. I'm just gonna say that one more time, guys, with a little bit of emphasis on it. However, in October of 1974, a random guy allegedly confessed to killing that entire family with 2 of his friends. And nobody was about to take credit for something that Dennis did. That's when an editor at the Wichita Eagle received an anonymous phone call that directed him to a mechanical engineering book at the Wichita Public Library. Police found the book and a letter which detailed in-depth facts about the case that were unknown to the public, something that only somebody with intimate knowledge of the crime scene or that the killer would know. The Wichita Eagle called the police, and back in the 70s, the media typically did what the police asked them. In this instance, police asked them not to talk about this because they didn't want the public to know that there could possibly be a serial killer on the loose. In this letter, Dennis named himself BTK, as he would later be infamously known as. Usually killers don't name themselves, it's just something that catches in the headlines, but he apparently felt like he deserved a name. He said that the police would come to know his crimes because he would bind, torture, kill. Because he would bind, torture, and kill, equaling BTK. Now guys, when Dennis wrote this letter, his wife Paula was 3 months pregnant. Can you even imagine? Like, what a lunatic. So 1974 was a crazy year for Dennis. Between the family massacre and Catherine, he had now killed 5 people. Since Dennis committed the 2 crimes very differently, the police didn't suspect that the same killer was responsible. And not only that, the police didn't have any leads or anything connecting him at all other than that vague sketch, which would later embolden him. However, in 1975 and 1976, Dennis went through his first quote-unquote cooling period, and he didn't commit any other crimes for 2 years. Although this is common with serial killers, it is still so incredibly chilling to think about. Dennis had the ability to somehow turn this sadistic sexual fantasy killer side of him off, which I actually would argue was his main side, and go home to his wife and act like nothing ever happened. In 1975, he and Paula welcomed their first child, a son named Bryan, and after Bryan was born, Dennis continued his education and later started his bachelor degree in science and administrative justice. Going back and thinking about the other children that he killed, and then now welcoming your own child like nothing happened, is a horrifying level of disassociation and compartmentalization, in my opinion. Finally, Dennis had enough playing daddy dearest. His urges were building up inside of him again, and he was gearing up again to go on another killing spree. Almost 3 years after he killed Catherine, it was the day that he was now supposed to go after a woman named Cheryl, one of his quote-unquote projects whom he had met at a bar, but Cheryl wasn't home. Now, this was not part of the plan, and this enraged Dennis. How could she not be home? He had been stalking her, learning her schedule, learning her routine, and this was not in it. And he wasn't just going to go home and forget about it, because for Dennis, and I quote this, the train was already on the tracks, which is actually a phrase that Dennis used to describe the way he felt when things like this would happen. He planned for this day. Since his wife would be at work and he had an alibi, he had dressed up in a tweed overcoat and had a briefcase that contained his tools, or what he called his hit kits, where it had all the items that he would use during his crimes. He was prepared, and his hit kits included all types of bondage and ropes, chains, gags, plastic bags, etc. So to him, there was no turning back at this point. It wasn't even an option. Once he made up his mind, his twisted desires took over him, and he would do anything to satisfy himself. So it didn't matter that Cheryl wasn't home. He would find somebody else. Luckily for Dennis, he had scoped out this neighborhood and already had a few other projects of his in mind. So instead, he went down the neighborhood streets and knocked on a few doors of his projects, but nobody answered the door. Then he went down a different street and came in contact with a 5-year-old boy, Stephen Relford. He showed the boy a picture and asked if he recognized the people in it, and the boy said no. Then the boy went inside his house. Dennis saw this as an opportunity. Surely there had to be a woman inside, likely the little boy's mother. So about 15 minutes later, he went up to the house and knocked on the little boy's door. Little Stephen opened the door and was immediately shoved out of the way, and Dennis stormed into the house. Dennis pulled down the blinds, turned off the TV, and forced Stephen and his 2 siblings to get in the bathroom. Then he pushed a bed against the door so the kids could not get out. However, there was a crack in the door, where Stephen was able to have almost a direct line of view of his mother, Shirley Vian's bedroom. Dennis told Shirley he planned on having his way with her. She was freaking out, but somehow he was able to lead her to believe that there wouldn't be any sort of sex assault, and calmed her down by giving her a glass of water and even smoked a cigarette with her. He even got her to ask her kids to stop screaming and promised if they did that everything would be okay. Little Stephen was in the bathroom watching through a crack and saw Dennis tape his mother's hands and her feet around her back, put a bag over her head, a rope around her neck, and lay her face down. Then he left. Stephen kept ramming the door over and over again until finally there was a hole in it. He ran to his mother's room and saw what he now describes as an image burned in his head that will never go away. Dennis strangled Shirley with a cord around her neck. He also left his bodily fluids on her underwear, which were found next to her body. He did not touch her sexually in any way. This was another case of his own solo satisfaction journey. Shirley was only 24 when she was murdered. Now at this point, Dennis was a father with a living child. It wasn't just an idea to him that he would one day maybe have a child, and yet he let these other kids scream and cry while they watched him brutally murder their mother. Dennis said that this didn't bother him though, because his objective was the mother. He even compared it to being in World War II and flying a bomber, with an enemy aircraft shooting you down, but the main focus is to drop the bombs and nothing else matters. Seriously, he actually compared young children crying for their mom as an enemy aircraft. He also wasn't worried about what would happen to them, saying that they were old enough to take care of themselves. Well, Stephen was the oldest, and he was just 5 or 6, so either that was a lie altogether, or it just goes to show how truly delusional Dennis was. Later on, Dennis said he thought that he would kill the kids too, but he either got spooked or decided not to. It almost goes without saying, but his complete lack of remorse and self-reflection is more than disturbing. It's just unfathomable. but certainly it's in line with the thought patterns of a full-blown narcissistic psychopath. Wichita police believed that the person responsible for Shirley's death could be related to the family massacre as well because of the way that Shirley was tied up and with those bodily fluids next to her. Which one point I want to make. Dennis Rader never assaulted anybody sexually, and he says that even serial killers have some type of taboo, and that was his. He never realized that this doesn't make him not that bad or less of an evil psycho because murder is still a crime, arguably the worst crime you could commit. So how is that too far, but murder is somehow okay? It's just ludicrous, and newsflash, that doesn't give you some type of moral compass, all right? You're still disgusting, you're still a pile of crap, and you're still creepy and weird as F. Now, the types of knots and bindings were also the same, which were kinds of knots not for holding somebody down or preventing them from moving. They were used for sexual gratification. Police also believed that while there was never a burglary per se, whoever was responsible took personal belongings from his victims, like underwear, bras, pantyhose, etc., to continue to fantasize about the situation long after the crime. Because Shirley's kids had seen him, Dennis was worried that they might be able to identify him. So he didn't immediately try to toy with law enforcement. He also waited until December, almost 9 months later, before he would pick his next victim. In December 1977, while he was feeling a little bit cocky because he now had gotten away with 6 murders and felt like he was in the clear since nothing had happened, he realized that he had made some planning mistakes with his past victims and close calls with unknown factors, so he wanted to make sure that his next project would go down without any hiccups. Dennis saw a young woman outside during one of his prowls. He had found his next victim in this, and that was 25-year-old Nancy Fox. She was petite, young, and blonde. He became obsessed with stalking her for several weeks leading up to December. He knew her routine and followed her to her jobs. Since it was the holiday season, Nancy had picked up a second job at the mall. Dennis actually followed her there and would just act like a random shopper so that he would just have the chance to talk to her or bump into her. I mean, this creepy guy, I don't even know what to say. I'm running out of words to even describe this lowlife. This is some sick stuff. On December 8th, 1977, he cut Nancy's phone line and then broke into her duplex from the back door. From there, he waited for her to come home, and when she did, he jumped out and surprised her with a gun. He told her that he had a sexual issue and that in order to get rid of that issue, he had to tie her up and assault her sexually. After being allowed to halfway undress herself in the bathroom, he made her go into her bedroom. Then he tied her up and started to undress himself and started to strangle her. As he strangled her, he confessed to her who he really was and what he had done in the past. Her body was found later with bodily fluids on her nightgown. Now at this point, Dennis was working for ADT. Yes, ADT, the security company. He went home to his wife and now 2-year-old son and again acted like business as usual. A normal day at work, nothing to see here, just hey guys, hey family, welcome home. I'm home after a long day, I'm so tired, where's dinner? In fact, he was probably the reason for ADT's sudden spike in business, and here he was, the reason that people wanted security and home protection in the first place. The following day on his way to work, Dennis was hungry for attention. Immediate attention this time. He needed acknowledgement from the police that they knew BTK killed again. So he decided to ring up the local police department from a payphone and said this. The police rushed to Nancy's duplex and found her body strangled to death. The police tried to replay the recording of his voice many times but never found a match, and at this point, the police hadn't 100% linked Nancy's death with BTK. Dennis was actually worried that many people may recognize his voice and then would say, oh my gosh, I know this guy, and that he would be caught. But he then reassured himself, thinking of all of the times in the past that he was never caught, even when he thought he was going down. Now, this emboldened Dennis and made him feel like he was special and much smarter than the police, which led him to making more risky decisions in the future. But in the meantime, he had to do some chores back in his double-life marriage to Paula and being a father to his son. In fact, a year later, in 1978, Paula and Dennis welcomed a second child, a daughter named Carrie. The same year in 1978, Dennis realized it had been 4 years since he had direct correspondence with the police through his letters. And now that he committed 2 more murders, he was looking for attention because he, or BTK, wasn't getting the publicity he felt he deserved. So he decided to approach another media outlet, KAKE, which I believe was an affiliate of ABC. He thought it would be a good idea to send a sarcastic poem about Nancy's murder, along with a serious letter where the mysterious BTK was again taking responsibility for the past 7 homicides, including Shirley and Catherine, and revealing intimate details about the crime. It was written the same way as the letter that was found in October of 1974 by the Wichita Eagle, except this letter included a term Factor X, which is something we will get more into later, but is basically the dark side of himself that he blames all of his actions on. The Wichita Police Department had not told the public that there was a serial killer on the loose, which frustrated him because he wanted his work to be recognized. In this letter, he wrote, "How many people do I have to kill to get my name in the paper? Signed, BTK." Ultimately, the police chief decided that he needed to come clean with the public. When Dennis heard the news, he said he felt a pretty big buzz, and it was a very big high for him. He finally got recognition and was feeling good about himself, and he even compared himself to a movie star. People in Wichita were absolutely terrified. It changed the entire way that they went about their routines. They didn't have an answer for what had happened, and they were just baffled. Young women were especially scared because they were worried that they would be the next victim. Dennis felt like he had control of the public, the news media, and the police department at this point. In November of 1978, police had another idea. Since so many of Dennis's letters were made of things he used a copy machine with, the police contacted Xerox, hoping that they would be able to identify or narrow down the copy machine. And they were able to. They figured out that it came from a copy machine at Wichita State University. This was the closest they would come to catching Dennis for a very long time. In 1979, he graduated with his bachelor's in science and administrative justice from Wichita State. He has later admitted to looking for things in his education that would help him in his crimes, like forensics. He said he made sure not to leave fingerprints and would wear gloves like you would wash dishes with. Of course, the DNA part didn't really dawn on him, since this was long before DNA was really used in solving crimes. All of these things just made him feel like some type of genius, and that now he knew what to do when committing crimes to go completely and totally unnoticed and not leave a trace of evidence. When asked what he wanted to do with his degree, he said that he applied for the Wichita Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, and Highway Patrol, but that they had all turned him away. Guys, quickly going to talk about parallels. Remember when Bryan applied for the internship with the local police department? Remember when he said he leaned on his education to figure out how to avoid certain things in his crimes from getting caught? Could all be a coincidence. But we also know he studied directly under the professor who worked with BTK, who wrote BTK's biography, who probably shared a lot about this in different classes and courses. So I'm just saying. At the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, one agent spoke out and said that they had read everything that he wrote and sent in. Every piece of paper was examined, everything looked at, and not one piece ever had a fingerprint, hair, a fiber that could be identified, nothing. So Dennis definitely was trying to cover his tracks the best he could, and the classes that he took were helping him evade being on police's radar. On April 28, 1979, Dennis had plans to kill another unsuspecting woman. This time, a 63-year-old named Anna Williams. Dennis staked out her house all day, but finally gave up because she was taking too long to come home. Anna didn't know this, but at the time, this actually saved her life. However, 2 months later, Anna figured out that she was a target after she received several of her personal items, like a scarf, in the mail that Dennis had taken from the house, along with a poem that read, "Oh, Anna, why didn't you appear?" Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been to open your mailbox and see your own items being sent to you with a creepy poem? This was also a way to get law enforcement's attention again, because he hoped that she would call the police and that they would know BTK was still out there. In 1980, he decided to take his second major cooling off period. It was 2 years since his last murder, since his plans with Anna didn't work out, and he actually didn't kill anyone again for many years. Again, he laid low and got on with pretending his life was normal, just raising his children and being married. To the public and the police, it seemed like he literally just vanished, and that everything would get back to normal for the most part. There were times where he felt like the police could be closing in and believed that the next knock on the door would be the police ready to arrest him, and even later said that calling the police and letting them hear his voice was one of his biggest regrets. Between raising his kids and faking his normal life, he said that he didn't have time to kill anyone, but the stalking never stopped. During his longer cooling periods, like this one, it's not like all of a sudden his urges went away. Instead, he would use some of his trophies, like bras, underwear, pantyhose, the pictures that he took of the bodies, all to pleasure himself in secret. Sometimes he would even wear a mask and wigs and wear some of the things that he took and take pictures of himself to try to replicate the crime scene. And he would take these pictures of himself with a tripod that he had set up for his Polaroid camera. He wanted to picture what the victims felt like when they were about to die. Guys, the pictures he took of himself are available online if you look for them, and they are disgusting and disturbing, so be warned. He kept some of his tokens or trophies in what he called hidey holes, because at this point he had so much stuff that he couldn't keep it all inside his house. He had a very detailed map of all of the locations where things were buried all over Wichita. He also kept a few journals where he would draw the scenes from some of his victims. Another thing, he would take note cards and cut out pictures of models from magazines or drawings of women with ropes, and then take the note cards with him while he went on drives. He pretended like the model on the note card was with him, and he would start talking dirty to it. Then he would get home with his note card, get in the shower, and, pleasure himself. Dennis later admitted that the reason there weren't more victims during these years was because he had just as much fun playing with himself as he would the victims, which I'm literally like vomiting over here, guys. That is like so disgusting to think about. Ugh. Bro, keep it to yourself. Keep it to yourself. His wife and children had no idea that this was ever going on. However, there were 2 occasions when he got sloppy, and his wife caught him dressed in bra and nightgown type outfits with a mask on. Of course, murder didn't pop into her head. She just thought he was just dressing in her nightgowns or something, and something's a little suspicious here. And she told him, "This is it. If you ever do this again and I catch you, I will leave you and I'll take the kids. Too weird for me." Dennis was mainly upset because he got caught, but made sure that it never happened again, as in getting caught again, not dressing up and doing his own, hanky-panky with himself. He never stopped carrying out his fantasies, even when it meant risking his life with his wife and his children. In 1984, the Wichita Police Department created a task force to find BTK because they didn't believe that he just disappeared, and they wanted to figure out who the madman behind the initials was. The task force was called Ghostbusters. By 1985, it had been 8 years since his last murder, and the police and public thought that maybe BTK did go away. Maybe he died, maybe he got arrested in another state, nobody was sure. He was involved in church, and his children were now 10 and 7. His son joined the Cub Scouts, and Dennis became the Cub Scout leader. One of the things he enjoyed the most was teaching all of the different kinds of knots you can make. Gross, you guessed it. Although none of those things seemed to truly matter to him, because he already had his eye on his next victim, 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, aka Project Cookie. Maureen had lived on the same block as Dennis's family for over 30 years in Park City, Kansas. Maureen was a widow and kind and a devoted mother to her 3 daughters, 1 son, and grandchildren. She enjoyed bingo, yard work, and attending church. It's interesting because up till this point, it seemed like for the most part, Dennis had gone after younger women, and a lot of the younger women in the Wichita community feared being attacked the most. But as you see, he didn't have a preference. His target was pretty much anyone he chose. April 27, 1985, Dennis was in the middle of one of his son's Boy Scout campout weekends when he claimed to have a headache and said that he needed to leave. You'd think that while you're at a Boy Scout weekend for your son and you're actually one of the leaders, that it would maybe seem like not a great time to go and kill someone, but no, Dennis knew no bounds. He is truly despicable. Well, so much for that headache, which we kind of already knew was a lie, because instead he got into his car and went to a bowling alley nearby. There he bought a beer and spilled some on his shirt and swished around some beer in his mouth so that he would smell like alcohol, or look like he had been drinking. Then he got a taxi to Park City. He got to Maureen's house and cut her phone line. Then he snuck through the back door. He assumed that she would be home, and to his surprise, she wasn't. So he waited and finally saw a car pull up into the driveway. However, it wasn't just Maureen coming home. There was a man with her. He wasn't expecting to see anybody else, so he decided to hide in Maureen's closet until the man left. He didn't want to have another Kevin situation where Kevin escaped and gave the police that sketch of him. Finally, at 1 a.m., the man left and Maureen went to sleep. Dennis jumped out of the closet, turned on the bathroom light, and got on top of Maureen and started choking her to death. Once she had died, he dragged her body outside into the trunk of her car. He drove to the church where he was on the church council and had keys to the building. Then he put black plastic over the window so that nobody could see inside and dragged her body to the basement of the church. He positioned Maureen on the altar with her body tied up in a sexually graphic form of bondage and took photographs with a Polaroid camera before putting her body back in the trunk of the car and taking off. Then he dumped the body in a ditch along a dirt road known as a dump site for dog carcasses not that far from their neighborhood in Park City. He buried her body under the trees and brush. When Dennis discussed this and was asked if he felt bad about doing that in a church, he said something to the effect of, "Yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that." This was also the first time he took a body out of the house. Criminal experts have theorized that he was getting more bold and actually more reckless and sloppy. Maureen didn't show up the next day at her job at the coffee shop, and the manager and longtime friend of Maureen's was concerned. Maureen would just never not show up and was always an extremely dependable worker. A welfare check was done on Maureen, and a missing persons report went out for Maureen. 8 days later, Maureen's car was found with a blanket and bedspread in the trunk. Police found her purse in the car, but her ID was gone. Police searched all weekend, and 3 days later, on May 5th, 1985, Maureen's body was found. She was completely nude, and there was a pair of pantyhose in knots next to her body. Her autopsy revealed she died of strangulation. Her children and her grandchildren were devastated. But again, Dennis walked away seemingly scot-free, getting away with yet another murder. When investigating her death, the police noticed that her phone line was cut and thought it could be BTK since he hadn't been caught, but since her body wasn't in the house, they were having trouble making a concrete connection. By September of 1986, a little over a year since the last murder, Dennis had already picked out his next target, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle, and he started to stalk her. He walked by her house during the day and listened to her play the piano while he would brainstorm and carefully plan out what he would do when he killed her. On September 16th around 10 a.m., Dennis dressed up as someone who worked for the telephone company and went to Vicki's door. She let him in, thinking he was going to do maintenance on her phone line or fix it. He messed with the phone for a little bit, but then cut the phone line, took out a gun, and forced her into the bedroom. As he was trying to tie her up, Vicki fought back, leaving some scratches and cuts on Dennis. And he was not about to let her get away or escape, so he immediately got out a rope and choked her with a ton of force. He took some photos of her body in different poses and then took off in Vicki's car. Bill Wegerle, Vicki's husband, actually passed Dennis in Vicki's car, but later said he didn't know who was driving it. When he got home, he saw his 2-year-old in the living room and found his wife on the floor, a little bit underneath the bed. Dennis got rid of any evidence, parked Vicki's car a few blocks away from her house, and then walked home, changed his clothes, and went back to his life as a family man. Again, like nothing happened. Vicki's husband, Bill, was investigated for his wife's death at first, but they couldn't prove it was him, and Dennis got away with another murder. Police had no idea that this was BTK, and the case remained unsolved. With now 9 victims under his belt, Dennis took another 5-year hiatus, disappearing and frustrating the police once again. He was in his mid-40s now, and proud that he was able to go undetected for so long. In 1991, Dennis's children were 15 and 13, and he was still married to Paula. Dennis wanted to kill a 10th victim and wanted to plan this one out very carefully. He figured that older women were more vulnerable than the younger women, so he set out to find his next project. And he found her, a 62-year-old woman named Dolores Davis, who lived alone and only lived a mile and a half away from Dennis's home. She was a good, kind, and loving person. He had a very well thought-out plan to get what would now be his last victim. He was going camping with the Cub Scouts over the weekend and thought that this would be the perfect opportunity for him to be able to get away with it without his family knowing. On January 19, 1991, he came up with another excuse to leave the Cub Scouts camping meeting. Then he drove his car to his parents' house and changed. He drove to a Baptist church in Park City, parked, and began walking. Once he got to her house, he waited outside until he thought that she would be asleep. He took a cinder block and broke out the glass on the back door to break in. This woke Dolores up, and she came out of her bedroom and saw Dennis standing there. He tied her up with her own pantyhose, and in her bedroom, he whispered in her ear, "I'm BTK," and then strangled her. Like he did with Maureen, he took her body and put it in the trunk of her own car. Then he drove it near a lake and hid the body as well as other items that he used underneath some trees. He drove to a lake near Park City and hid the body and evidence underneath some trees near Park City, and of course took some photos. Then he drove back to her house, took her jewelry box, wiped down the car for fingerprints, and left to go back to the Baptist church where his car was parked. Once in his car, he drove straight back to where Dolores was, put her body in the trunk, and then dumped it under a bridge in Sedgwick County. This time he went back to change into his Cub Scout leader uniform and went back to the camping weekend where his son and other teenage boys were. Dolores had a boyfriend who came to her house the next day and saw the broken window and noticed that she was missing, and he filed a missing persons report. Even though Dennis was back at the camp, he snuck out again the next night to go back to the body. On the way back to the camp, he ran into a state trooper at a rest area, and the guy said, "Hey, there was a crime, we're looking for anyone out here that looks out of place." And Dennis was immediately worried about that jewelry box in his car, and if the trooper was going to ask to look inside. But since he was in a Cub Scout uniform and explained that he was just heading back to the camping weekend, the state trooper didn't think he stood out, and so he left. Police discovered her body and later identified Dolores. There was nothing in her house. The car didn't have prints, and there was really nothing for the police to go off of. In the past, police considered that Maureen and Vicky could have been killed by BTK, and now possibly even Dolores. But because of the huge gaps of time between and the many differences, police really didn't know for sure. After 1991, even though he never killed another victim, he never stopped stalking or hunting potential projects. In May of 1991, he became a dog catcher and a compliance officer in Park City. Basically, this job was just to monitor neighborhoods and make sure that homes were in compliance. In a way, this job gave him a reason to be out on the streets at night, but this time with a uniform and an official position. So he had a grandiose sense of superiority and authority over others. And neighbors recalled him, again, as being sometimes overzealous and extremely strict, as well as taking special pleasure in bullying and harassing single women. 13 years passed, and it was January 15th, 2004, marking the 30th anniversary of the family massacre murders. And it was also 25 years since his last correspondence with police or media. So since it was a 30th anniversary, a headline in a newspaper came out saying, "After 30 years, BTK remains unsolved." In the article, it mentioned an attorney was writing a book on BTK and his 7 victims. This enraged Dennis. He was so arrogant that he had to be the one to tell his story, his legacy, and saying that it was only 7 victims since the real number was 10 was unacceptable to him.
This morning, we have more information on the letter sent to the Wichita Eagle by the BTK killer.
The Wichita Eagle received a letter from Bill Thomas Kilman that had a photocopy of an old Polaroid that showed a woman's body on the floor and a copy of the driver's license, Vicky Wegerle. The letter also included details that only the killer would know, and investigators knew that they never took pictures of her body on the floor. The end of the letter had BTK's signature. He hoped that this would be a declaration that BTK was still out there, on the loose, and that people needed to be afraid. With this letter and BTK claiming an 8th victim, It sparked fear throughout the community, who now for 25 years had thought that this maniac had gone away, died, or maybe was in prison, anything. They certainly didn't believe that he was living among them, so this was very upsetting. Then in May of 2004, another task force was set up by the Wichita Police Department, made up of the FBI and KBI agents as well. They were set out on finding the killer. Their goal was to keep BTK to continue communicating with them in hopes that he would eventually get cocky and mess up. News headlines came out and said that the killer could be a normal person. A few months later, another media outlet received a letter that they believed was from BTK. The letter included chapter titles for a BTK biography, almost like a guide for how the media should cover him. And then there was a puzzle, a find the word letter grid, spelling out clues like prowl and fantasies. Dennis loved the attention that he was getting from the media and legitimately thought that the police would never be able to find him, which kind of was a fair point because it had been 30 years and nothing had happened. But it was his own narcissistic attributes that were actually his demise. In his screwed up game of cat and mouse, he had delusions about what kind of relationship he had with some of the lead detectives in this case. He thought that they respected him enough to always be honest with him, and he even felt like he had a bond with some of them when he would see them on TV. A few months later in 2004, he asked the police if he could correspond directly through them with a floppy disk, but the police had to promise that they wouldn't install anything on the disk to track his computer. And if the police agreed, they needed to put an ad in the newspaper that said, "Rex, it will be okay," with the location of where to drop off the floppy disk. When they went through the metadata of the floppy disk, they were able to extract different files of different users. One called Christ of the Lutheran Church in Park City, and another file called Dennis. I mean, what an idiot. Like, you actually are going to trust the police that they're not going to look up the digital evidence to figure out who you are, a possible serial killer? Get real, my guy. So this was a major break for the investigators. They tracked him down, and pretty easily, since he was the president of the church council. So they finally had a name, Dennis Rader. But before he could be arrested, the police needed to do some housekeeping on their end to make sure that the arrest would stick. They went back through all of the cases, starting back in 1974, and collected the DNA samples back then. At this point in 2005, DNA had come a really long way. So they were extremely lucky that the DNA evidence was all preserved correctly, since some of the DNA was collected 3 decades before. Once they analyzed it, they were able to match it all to the same person. Then they had to figure out a way to get Dennis's DNA, to get his sample to see if it was a match. Someone from the KBI realized that his daughter Carrie had attended college at Kansas State University and got a court order for her records to see if they had any samples that she had maybe given at the clinic there. One of the samples on file was from a feminine exam that she had. They tested the DNA and found that her DNA was 100% the offspring of BTK. Shortly after that, local police, KBI, and FBI set their eyes on Dennis, and they were ready to get this guy. On February 25th, 2005, they started tracking him with tons of undercover cars and helicopters. They pulled him over, yanked him out of the car, and he said to the officers, "Would you mind telling my wife I won't be home for lunch? I'm certain you know where I live." When his arrest was announced by the media, many women were crying with tears of joy because finally this maniac serial killer was going to be behind bars and they wouldn't have to worry every night that they could be his next victim. It's like the community collectively gave a major exhale. His family and friends were shocked, stunned, and horrified. His wife filed for an emergency divorce, which was granted almost immediately. Paula has never done any interviews and seems to want absolutely nothing to do with it. However, his daughter has done a lot of interviews and has even written tell-all books. None of his family had any clue what was going on, like not even the slightest clue, which kind of makes them victims in all of this too. I literally can't imagine the horror they went through when this all came to light. During his interrogation, once he found out that they had DNA samples and the games were over, he confessed to the police.
We had moved him to a room that we had prepared, and he started talking and kind of danced around for a while.
And then they brought up the DNA. These samples were correctly preserved, and they could nail him.
Anyway, you can get out the DNA, right? You can't get out your DNA unless you've had a total blood transfer and lost every organ. It's there.
And it was at almost the exact 3-hour mark of them being in the room. And he said, "You got me. I'm BTK."
Yes, you guys know. What else can I say?
Say who you are. BTK. You're BTK.
And the belt that I used was the belt I was wearing, and I had her come back. And I whispered to her a little bit. But just didn't know. I told her BTK was a bad guy, and she really smirked.
He spoke for over 30 hours.
And Chelsea, she says, "What's going to happen for the rest of the world?" I said, "Now you're going to have your life for the rest of your family."
And he showed no remorse, no regret. The only regret he showed during this was that there weren't more victims. He told us that we would discover what he termed his mother lode.
There were journals and drawings. He had materials that he collected from each of his victims.
4 months later, he pled guilty in court, and during this, the judge asked him to confess to everything. He was sentenced to 10 life sentences, which I think at the time in Kansas was 175 years, all without the possibility of parole. BTK has been studied by many criminal psychologists over the years, and he has had many college classes taught about him, books written, and even some television series. Mindhunters on Netflix had a few episodes featuring BTK in their storyline, but again, most famously, Dr. Catherine Ramsland developed a professional relationship with him, and he agreed to tell her everything so that she could study him. She has written several popular books about him as well. Recently, a documentary was made about BTK where she spoke about him in depth.
Later in life, as I became a professor of forensic psychology, extreme offenders were something we knew very little about, and I wanted to contribute to that. I've published 68 books and have 4 more in the works. Not only do I write about serial killers, I'm constantly teaching, I do police trainings, I do a broad variety of activities, all surrounding my knowledge of extreme offenders. A lot of myths have cropped up about serial killers, so I especially want to study cases that show that these myths just don't work. And law enforcement needs to understand this so that they don't dismiss a potential suspect too soon. One of the reasons I wanted to work with him was to look at someone who appears to be an outlier and see what he teaches us. Because he's not unique. There are others who have been family men, churchgoers, seemingly normal people who have these thoughts and sometimes act on these thoughts. And so I think it's important for us to not just understand them, but also treat them before they become serial killers.
Most recently, Dr. Ramsland has been in the media because Dr. Ramsland actually taught the suspect of the Idaho murders, Bryan Kohberger. BTK didn't get enjoyment out of people in pain. He liked the worry, the fear, and the suffering that he inflicted on his victims. That's what he enjoyed the most. And he called this his Factor X, which Dr. Ramsland really thinks it's just something he refers to because she believes this makes him feel special, like he has a supernatural mystifying element about him, so that she needs him so she can study him, but she believes it's just a way to not take any accountability for any of his actions. She also said that the one thing that BTK can't get over is that the police didn't respect him enough to not lie to him, specifically about the floppy disk. She said his narcissism makes him completely blind to the fact that they were never his friends and never enjoyed this game of cat and mouse.
They're talking to Rader, and Lieutenant Landwehr pulls up in a Ziploc evidence baggie with the purple floppy disk in it. He slides it in front of Rader and says, "You know what this is?" Dennis Rader starts poking his finger forcefully on this floppy disk. And he says, "I got a question."
I need to ask. Sure. Do you like? How can you like?
Because I was trying to catch you.
She has also said that most serial killers aren't very creative, and this was especially true for BTK. He did a lot of copycat things from previous serial killers, and even things he read about in detective magazines, like changing the thermostat of the homes to really hot, taking photographs of women suffering. Those were all things that other serial killers had done first. So I want to go back to BTK's many applications to all of the different law enforcement agencies that he didn't get hired for. When he got his bachelor's degree in administrative justice, Dr. Ramsland said that because of this study, he felt like he knew more and could be a better predator. She also said that serial killers who are attracted to law enforcement know that a police officer is in a position to know a lot more about potential victims, and they can approach people with a sense of authority, like flashing a badge and being in uniform, which thank God he was never hired for any of those jobs because that is terrifying.
Did you ever think about what it would be like for you if somebody entered your home and did something like that to your wife?
I would have stepped in and fought him for sure, doing everything possible to protect my wife or my kids.
But I mean, what if you found her dead, murdered? What would that have been like for you?
Oh, that would have been very upsetting. It's like revenge to come back on me.
When I asked him what would happen if he came home and found someone had murdered his wife, there's no sense of outrage or horror that somebody could have done this to his family. It's more resignation. Ah, well, karma. Instead of empathizing with his loved one's suffering, he's only able to see how their possible demise would affect him.
And guys, I'm just going to say, not for nothing, but going back to those parallels with Bryan, learning things from his education, wanting to be in a position of authority, a trusted position, and taking bits and pieces from other serial killers. BTK did that. Is that what Bryan was doing as well? And was one of those serial killers BTK? Was another person mass murderer Elliot Rodger? Did he try to mess up the profile? This story is dark, disgusting, and showcases the absolute bottom of the barrel scum of humanity. Killers like BTK are a sombering reminder that there are literally monsters among us, which is terrifying. There aren't really words for it. I'd imagine this is very much like how the Moscow, Idaho community was recently feeling in the wake of the recent quadruple homicide. BTK was a church leader, had a family, yet simultaneously thought he was a monster, but also someone who was a good person who did bad things, all while killing 10 people over 3 decades for his own depraved and heinous fantasies. It is a mind warp. I can't imagine how gaslit and confused I'd feel if I were one of his children or his spouse, and my heart truly goes out to them. His daughter Carrie has done several interviews as well as writing that tell-all book I mentioned.
Carrie Rawson was 26 years old on the day she learned her father was the cold-blooded killer known as BTK, the man responsible for killing 10 people and terrorizing Wichita, Kansas for decades.
What do you remember about that day?
There's a knock on my door, and he said he was the FBI, and then he says, your dad has been arrested as BTK. And I was like, I think I'm gonna pass out.
How would you describe your childhood with your father?
I pretty much had the American dream, you know, like the 3-bedroom ranch with the big backyard and the Springer Spaniel dog. And then when I was 4, he built a massive tree house for my brother and I. It was extremely out of the characteristic of my father to be physically abusive.
After the last killing in 1991, life went on for the Rader family. Carrie going off to college and meeting her future husband.
He just seemed like another regular Wichita dad to me.
And then in 2003, my dad walked me down the aisle at our wedding.
BTK is arrested.
Police say this man, 59-year-old Dennis Rader, is the BTK strangler.
And you were still at that point convinced that they had the wrong man?
I think reality was starting to creep in, and I felt my stomach just twist, realizing it could be true.
1 minute, you had a man in your life who you thought was a loving father.
Right.
The next minute, he's a serial killer.
Right. I had to learn how to grieve the loss of somebody I loved very much that no one else loved anymore.
BTK was once one of the most terrifying serial killers in America in the 20th century. Luckily for society, BTK will be in prison for the rest of his life, in a small cell, just given 3 meals and only allowed to do what the prison allows him to do, which is pretty ironic since all of his crimes were about control and power, and now he has 0 power at all. Sometimes I wonder if with all of the technology and resources that law enforcement has today, if there will ever be serial killers like this again in the future. I go back and forth on whether or not it's possible, but I'd like to know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think modern science and technology will prevent serial predators in the future by catching them before they can go on a spree? Or do you think they will find another way to go undetected? Let me know below. Another thing I keep thinking about is how BTK modeled other serial killers. Like, in a way, he wanted to be like these so-called legends in his mind, or at least categorized as such. And I don't think this phenomenon is solely specific to BTK. It's scary to think that there are probably other people in the world who look up to a guy like this. Maybe somebody like Bryan Kohberger. Thanks so much for tuning in with me today, guys. I hope you appreciated the case coverage, and I'm eager to know your thoughts below. Do you see any similarities or parallels between BTK and Bryan, or do you think it's all a coincidence? Let me know. Thanks again, and don't forget, hit that subscribe button on your way out so that you don't miss any future case videos, and please also show your support for the channel by quickly liking this video and hitting the thumbs up. All right, until the next one, stay safe. Bye.